Richard Nixon always looked like he was storing bananas in his mouth. He did. Richard Nixon always looked like he used to store bananas or food in his mouth, like a squirrel. I remember that about Richard Nixon because I remember there was this whole storyline about Richard Nixon storing food in his mouth. Like, you know how how a squirrel and animals like that, they would store food in their mouths. Like, I remember how when I was in grade school, we used to get the Weekly Reader in grade school. And I think it was either Weekly Reader or one of those, where it was one of those periodicals like that, where it had a photo of a squirrel storing food in its mouth, because you know how squirrels would forage for food and they would store it in their mouths and their cheeks would puff out like this. And my teacher did an imitation of a squirrel doing that, and it was funny. She said, sometimes you see a squirrel with its cheeks puffed out like this, storing food. That's because they're storing food in their mouth. Around the same time, I remember Channel 12 had this slide of Richard Nixon. This was after Richard Nixon had resigned in disgrace. But Channel 12 still kept showing this slide of Richard Nixon, where he was sitting there and his cheeks were puffed out like that, like he was storing food in his mouth. Like, he was sitting there like this. Richard Nixon was sitting there like this. So one day at the supper table, I took pineapples or something and shoved a big bite of pineapples, and I went like this. And I said I was, and my mom got mad. She said, why are you playing with your food like that? And I said I was Richard Nixon storing food in my mouth. So anyway, so then every time, for a long time after that, every time we had bananas at the dinner table, that's what I would do. I would always pretend like I was storing them in my mouth, like Richard Nixon. I would take a bite of a banana like this. And then I would go like this. And then I say, I'm Richard Nixon, and I'm storing a banana in my mouth. I am not a crook, but I am a squirrel. See? I'm storing a banana in my mouth. And there's also a storyline where Bert from Sesame Street was afraid of Richard Nixon because Bert's head was shaped like a banana, and he thought that Richard Nixon was going to mistake him for a banana and come along and eat him. So there was a storyline. So I came up with a storyline where Richard Nixon visited Sesame Street. And then Ernie said, "Oh, don't go out there, Bert." "Oh, why not, Ernie?" "Richard Nixon's out there, and you're afraid of him, Bert, because you're afraid he's gonna bite your head off, Bert." So anyway, this is so that's what he did. So Richard Nixon would store bananas. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. And he would store them in both cheeks, too, like this. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. That was after he was disgraced in front of the whole country. So, instead of Watergate, they should have had Bananagate. So anyway, And also, Richard Nixon had shingles once, and he says, I had shingles that bled through my suits, and it ruined my suits. So he did use the word ruin. He used the magic word. Because his shingles bled through his suits and ruined them. And also, there's a funny story here. There's a funny news story about the conservative. It's about, there's some right-wing conservative conference that's going on now. I think it's the CPAC. I think it's Conservative Political Action Conference. I think that's what that stands for. And Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, is there, and he gave a big speech about how he went into a restaurant that had a salad bar, and the chocolate pudding on the salad bar was spoiled. And he says, it's the liberals' fault that it was spoiled. He says, I took a big bite of the chocolate pudding, only to discover that it was completely rancid, rotten and spoiled. It was awful. But he didn't say it. He didn't say it was ruined. He just said it was spoiled. And he says it was the liberals' fault that he got spoiled pudding at a restaurant salad bar. He said that. So anyway, maybe he should have just stored bananas in his mouth like Richard Nixon. So the next time you see a squirrel walking around with his cheeks puffed out, you know that it was inspired by Richard Nixon, because the squirrel probably saw Richard Nixon doing that, and that's where they got the idea. Or maybe Richard Nixon, maybe the squirrel actually is Richard Nixon. Maybe Richard Nixon was reincarnated as a squirrel that goes around storing bananas in its mouth. And the funny thing is, what does it do? When you're Richard Nixon and you store bananas in your mouth, why? The question is why? But why did Richard Nixon store bananas in his mouth? Was he afraid that there's going to be a banana shortage and he wasn't going to find any bananas later on? So he had to store them? And wouldn't that pretty much destroy the bananas by storing them in your mouth? Like they're acorns or something? Because it seems like the bananas would rot in there from all the saliva, and then he would be walking around with a big gob of saliva mixed with bananas, and then he would have to like spit it occasionally, like a person chewing tobacco, and he would have to keep going. Pfft, pfft. So that's so that's the story of Richard Nixon storing bananas in his mouth, and Bert from Sesame Street being afraid of him because of it. Bert suffered from Richard Nixon phobia because he was afraid of Richard Nixon mistaking him for a banana and eating him. And he was afraid of Mr. Hooper too, because Mr. Hooper wanted to use them as an ingredient in his milkshakes. So that's the story of Richard Nixon and Bert.